Hello, hello, dear listener. Thanks for joining me. You're listening to your gal, Militant Empathy. So this is a new show about politics, philosophy, society, and culture, inspired primarily by my need to monologue about any given subject at any given time. Maybe making this podcast will help me finally stop being such a bummer at parties, but probably not. So in each episode, we will take a big meandering deep dive into a distinct topic. And for this season, in no particular order, I've got episodes planned on justice, the police, borders, mental health, sex, and strong women. I'm hoping that you'll be getting these on a monthly basis, but you can always keep up with the show by following us on Instagram at Militant Empathy. Follow us on whatever podcasting platform you're getting us through. And while you're there, maybe leave us a review or follow us on Patreon at patreon.com/Militant Empathy. So for this first episode, and by way of introduction, I want to talk to you about community. Specifically, I want to talk to you about what threatens our sense of community or our ability to form community in the present day. So I want to come at this question kind of sideways, structuring my argument around the work of a couple of philosophers, basically asking, what would X branch of philosophy have to say about the fragmentation of society and why that's happening? So I want to start off nice and easy with a popular fave, Karl Marx. Now, I'm pretty sure we've all heard something about Marx, right? So, to give you the broad strokes, good old Marx was a German philosopher who was kicking about in the 19th century. So that's the 1800s, which not incidentally is also the peak of the Industrial Revolution. So he's definitely most well known for being the granddaddy of communism. But what I want to talk about here is not his ideological contributions. And, I'm pretty sure that we've all heard a fair bit about communism, right? Instead, what I want to talk about is this, the theoretical framework that underpinned his thinking, something called historical materialism. So first, I'm going to give you a quick rundown of what historical materialism is, and then I'm going to use that framework to answer the hypothetical question that I would pose to Marx of what's fucking up community in the 21st century. So first things first, what do I mean by a theoretical framework? Well, I'm really talking about, how we decide to go about answering a question. So a theoretical framework basically helps you to decide what information it's important to include in your answer. So this may seem a bit counterintuitive. Your instinct might be to say, well, we need to include all the information. But, when we're talking about the huge questions Marx was dealing with, like what causes historical change? What is the driving force of humanity? What moves history forwards, etc.? It's actually impossible to include all of the information out there. So there has to be this kind of filtering out process where you decide what's relevant and what's not. And that's where your theoretical framework comes in. So one thing that is very important for you to know about me straight off the bat is that the film National Treasure is extremely important to me. And no, I will not be expanding on that any further. Anyway, the movie National Treasure, a cinematic classic rivaled only by National Treasure 2, both of which are an embarrassingly large part of why I decided to become a historian in the first place. Anyway, in the first movie, there's this extremely realistic and historically accurate scene where Nicolas Cage finds these special four-lensed glasses that are used to reveal the treasure map on the back of the Declaration of Independence. And depending on what combination of the four lenses are being used, the map says different things. So that's kind of how a theoretical framework works as well. It decides what to filter out and what to highlight. So cut back to the 1800s and our main man, Marx. He's trying to answer the question, why are human societies the way that they are? He decides to answer this question in a historical manner, looking at the history of societies. Now, we have to remember that at the time Marx was grappling with this, most historical explanations were still focused on this, what I'm going to call the great man of history trope, right? So this is the thing wherein a lot of historical change, or really all historical change, was seen through the lives and eyes of great, typically white men. So basically everything was being explained as the result of X great white guy coming along. So to take a specific example, it's the kind of historical narrative that will say something like, Abraham Lincoln emancipated the slaves, and ignore literally everything else that was going on at that time, including the actions of enslaved people themselves, who were instrumental in putting pressure on the Union government to abolish slavery during the American Civil War. So Marx looks at this and he's like, fuck no. What's important is not what this handful of elites are up to, but the system that governs the daily lives of the masses. So he places explanatory weight not on, the kings and queens, the heads of state, etc., but rather on the overall economic system. Historical materialism, by definition, is a bottom-up way of looking at the world that says the most important factor in answering any question relating to human societies is the nature of economic production as experienced by the masses. So let's cut back now and apply that to the question that we have at hand today in this episode. So what would be the historical materialist explanation for community breakdown in society today? Now, we know from describing what's contained in this theoretical framework that the focus has got to be on overall economic structure and on the material experiences of the majority of the population. So what is our overall economic structure today? Well, in the UK, we have, since the 1980s, been living in an economic system known as neoliberalism, which is a very extreme form of capitalism. And it's extreme in that it advocates very strongly against any and all state intervention in the economy. Arguably, this system has more in common with the economic system that was in place during the Victorian era, which was also fiercely individualistic, meaning it emphasized the importance of, individual self-sufficiency, than it does with the economic system that was put into place just after World War II, known as Keynesianism, which was this very collectivist and pro-state way of looking at the economy that ended up building most of the modern welfare state. Now, in unpacking what exactly it is that's wrong with neoliberalism, I'm going to do the historian thing and give an overview of how it comes to predominate in society. So, in the UK, over the course of the 20th century, we've had three fairly distinct economic systems take hold. We began the century with a system known as laissez-faire economics, sometimes known also as classical economics. Now, this is the kind of capitalism that was advocated for by, for example, Adam Smith, a man who, by the way, also thought that medical practice should not be regulated by the state because this would constitute an undue interference in the market. So, do with that information what you will. But yeah, laissez-faire economics essentially believed that the best economic outcomes are produced when the state intervenes the least. Not to sound like too much of a prick, but yes, these are French words, and they literally translate as to allow you to do, which is basically how the system saw itself, so the government completely steps aside in order to allow people to do business. And its only role is basically to enforce the law and prevent public disorder. So you would have some, public provision of services under this model, but they'd be limited to things like workhouses to prevent mass homelessness, which was seen as disruptive to the market. These workhouses essentially being just a different kind of jail for poor people who could not afford to house or feed themselves. Similarly, you have some provision of free healthcare to those in need, particularly those suffering from infectious diseases like tuberculosis, leprosy, smallpox, etc. But this wasn't really motivated by a benevolent concern for others, more by concerns about how contagious diseases could be disruptive to the smooth operation of the market. So laissez-faire economics begins to crumble for a number of reasons. Firstly, governments realized that the sheer brutality of poverty that was induced under this non-interventionist system was inhibiting their ability to do things that they like to do, like wage war. So, for example, in 1897, the British government is involved in a colonial war called the Boer War, which is taking place in the territory that would one day come to be known as South Africa. And whilst they're recruiting heavily from the working classes, they're coming to realize that, upon medical inspection, up to 25% of the troops are so sickly and malnourished that they're not fit for war. So off the back of that, the British state starts to introduce some welfare measures to basically ensure that the state had a sufficient bank of able human bodies to call on in the event of a war. So, for example, the Liberal government of 1906 to 1914 introduces the first state pensions, they expand the provision of healthcare to more workers, they introduce free school meals, etc. Another important reason that this model begins to crumble is the realization that it's actually a really bad way to deal with economic crises. So because this model of economics did not believe in state intervention, if there was an economic downturn, for whatever reason, mass unemployment would mean that people literally just starved, right? And this is exactly what happens in 1929 when the US economy totally blows up during the Wall Street crash, which in turn has the knock-on effect of drying up one of the UK's largest export markets, which means that the UK's manufacturing industry is not able to shift as many goods as it needs to keep up with production levels, which means unemployment rises, meaning people starve. Admittedly, the Wall Street crash didn't have as big an economic impact on the UK as it did on some other countries like Germany, which was totally devastated by the crash, but it still wasn't good, right? It does end up strengthening calls for more state intervention, namely from the British Labour Party. And eventually, some 15-ish years later, it's the Labour Party's election to government under Clement Attlee right after the end of World War II that really sounds the death knell for this economic model, because under Attlee's administration, we enter into the second economic system of the 20th century, known as Keynesianism. So this is the part where I would have foghorns, by the way, guys. So imagine you're all hearing foghorns right now. So Keynesianism is named after its founder, a British economist called John Maynard Keynes, who basically tears up the core assumptions of laissez-faire capitalism like the absolute giga chad that he is. So where the previous system advocated for minimal state intervention, even in times of crises, Keynesianism believes that in some industries, state intervention is essential at all times to ensure the public good. For example, healthcare, the railways, the electrical grid, the water system, etc. All that good shit that our governments keep selling off to the highest bidder. He also argued that it's precisely during periods of economic crises that state intervention should be amped up. And in this, he was probably inspired quite a lot by his experience of living through World War II, because that's a period when governments basically took over the entire economy. So a good non-wartime example of a Keynesian approach to economic crises would be Franklin D. Roosevelt's New Deal project. So this is what the idea of, a Green New Deal is named after. So Roosevelt implemented this 4 years after the 1929 Wall Street crash as an attempt to get the economy going. And what he did was essentially just commission an enormous amount of public works projects. So basically the state took on the role of employer for the hundreds of thousands of Americans who were still unemployed by providing jobs, building things like hospitals, airports, roads, etc. Keynesianism then is basically a kind of state-based approach to the logic that you have to spend money to make money. But Keynesianism as an economic model also begins to crumble, and this time in the 1970s, because in the 1970s we see an economic phenomenon called stagflation begin to emerge. And this is where there is both a stagnation of economic productivity, so basically, fewer things are being produced, unemployment is rising, and also inflation, so rising prices. Now, Keynesianism could not really explain why this was happening. It saw inflation and stagnation as operating on a kind of seesaw where, if one went up, then it was assumed that the other would go down. So for example, if the government wanted to limit the inflation of prices, it might try, under Keynesian thinking, to control the price of certain goods. It could do this by implementing price controls or import tariffs. But the trade-off would be that unemployment would rise because profits are being stifled by the price controls, meaning that the market will react by trying to cut labor costs. So in the 1970s, when both inflation and unemployment are starting to go up at the same time, everyone's like, what the fuck is going on? And this gives the ideological opponents of Keynesianism the room to argue that it was not actually good at dealing with economic crises, and that the strategy of heavy government spending to try and essentially, pull the economy up by its bootstraps was in fact ineffective. But this is not really the aha moment that Keynes's opponents thought that it was, because what was causing stagflation at this time had little to do with state intervention in the UK and much more to do with international relations and international trade. So there was a union of oil-producing countries in the Middle East called OPEC, who in 1973 call on oil embargo on wealthy Western nations, including the UK and the US, in retaliation for their support of the State of Israel. Basically, they turn around and they say, we will not sell you any fucking oil. This in turn has a knock-on effect across the world because oil is needed not only in all different kinds of production, but also just to generate power. So the stagnation side of things is coming from what's called a supply side shock. It's not that consumers don't want to purchase goods, which would be a demand-side shock. It's that the supply chain has been disrupted, and so it's not able to produce sufficient goods to meet consumer demand. And this then drives up the price of those goods. And that's what's causing inflation, because there are not enough goods in the system to meet consumer demand. Now, I'm highlighting this because neoliberalism, which comes in to, save the day, incidentally and very usefully does fuck all to really address this issue of supply-side resilience. So I think we're all pretty acutely aware of this flaw within the neoliberal plan with, the hindsight of the past couple of years of energy crises and double-digit inflation. But anyway, here enters Margaret Thatcher, stage left, who is elected Prime Minister in 1979 and wastes zero time in heralding in this shiny new economic model called neoliberalism, the brainchild of an American economist from the University of Chicago called Milton Friedman. So everything Friedman believed was essentially a huge fuck you to Keynes, because he believed in the total supremacy of markets and that in times of economic downturn, the government should actually spend even less than normal to basically kill off any ineffective sectors of the economy that supposedly contributed to that downturn in this very painful kind of streamlining. And this is exactly what Thatcher does, particularly in relation to the mining industry. So Thatcher sees the British mining industry as highly economically ineffective. In the late 70s, most British coal mines were publicly owned, about 70%. And these miners had very high wages, in large part owing to the strength of the National Union of Miners. And because the NUM had the ability to fairly easily call a national strike and hamper the nation's ability to produce energy, and thus basically produce anything, it had, shall we say, a persuasive level of negotiating power throughout the post-war period. Thatcher fucking hates this and wants to basically shut most of these mines down and instead rely on imports of gas, coal, and oil from abroad, which was cheaper and meant that she would no longer have to deal with what she called, quote, the enemy from within, meaning the mining unions. Already we're kind of seeing the flaws in the plan, though. If Thatcher well and truly wanted to learn the lessons of the 1973 oil crisis, maybe she'd be saying something other than, hey, let's import all our sources of energy. Essentially, what I'm saying is that we should view the neoliberal project as fundamentally an ideologically motivated return to laissez-faire economics. It's not about what will make the economy more resilient, otherwise far more attention would have been given to the supply-side resilience question. Instead, it's about an ideological preferencing for a state whose sole role is to maintain social order. And we see this very clearly with Thatcher. In 1975, she spoke at a Conservative Party conference and declared that, quote, "A man's right to work as he will, to spend what he earns, to own property, to have the state as servant and not as master. They are the essence of a free economy, and on that freedom, all our other freedoms depend," end quote. 9 years later, she would be found ordering the Metropolitan Police into South Yorkshire to break up a miners' picket. The police would proceed to undertake this task so violently that the striking miners would, in 1991, receive a collective payout of £425,000 for assault, wrongful arrest, unlawful detention, and malicious prosecution. So we gotta ask, who, in fact, does Thatcher's free economy make free? Clearly, it's not the working classes who are being physically assaulted by agents of the state in order to facilitate this economic shift. And what about the end result? How has this shift affected community? Well, again, I think Mrs. Thatcher said it best herself. Quote, "There is no such thing as society. There are individual men and women, and there are families. People must look after themselves first." End quote. So that would be the Marxist take on community breakdown in our time. Pretty straightforward. The shift in material circumstances from Keynesianism to neoliberalism has resulted in the resurgence of a fierce individualism which has hampered our ability to meaningfully form community. Crucially, the point is that by removing or weakening the systems of collective organization, such as through limiting spending for the public good and violently suppressing trade union activity, neoliberalism didn't just change the economic model, it changed the social model. Because our lives, and not just our economic lives, but our whole lives, are, according to Marx, mostly shaped by the system that governs the means of production. Okay, so now we're going to get a bit weird. We're going to look to the theories of two further philosophers, but these guys come from a movement called postmodernism. Now, postmodernism emerges in the 1960s, and it's a critique of philosophical modernism, which was like the previous philosophical movement of which Marx was a part. Now, modernism is a very broad umbrella that doesn't correspond with the left or right of the political spectrum. Rather, it is characterized simply by a certainty that there is an objective reality out there somewhere. And that is therefore the job of the theorist to try and simply demystify that reality. So this is why both Marx, the granddaddy of communism, and someone like John Stuart Mill, a fervent fangirl of free market capitalism and the granddaddy of modern liberalism, can both be grouped together as modernist thinkers, even though clearly their ideas about what that underlying reality is do not align. Postmodernists, again, do not really correspond with the left or the right of the political spectrum, although they are often grouped with the left wing, particularly because many begin from this position of critiquing and adding to modern Marxism. But at core, postmodernists simply do not agree with the underlying assumption of modernism that there is an objective, tangible reality out there somewhere, separate from our attempts to perceive it. Instead, at the less extreme side of things, they argue that even if there is an objective reality out there, we as human beings, being inescapably bound by our own subjectivity, cannot realistically hope to uncover it. And indeed, that our very attempts to try and demystify this reality are just contributing to the construction of new subjective realities. Then at the more extreme side, certain postmodernists would question the existence of an objective reality at all. So put differently, right, postmodernism is then characterized by this kind of relativism, which highlights the social construction or irreality of the human existence. So to put it in generational terms, modernist philosophy comes off the back of the scientific revolution. It's characterized by this certainty and even arrogance about the potentialities of human knowledge. It's kind of this old boomer guy standing on a soapbox shouting about these truths which we hold to be self-evident. Whereas postmodern philosophy and relativism generally is like a sort of disenchanted millennial that retorts like, well, how do you know that exactly? In fact, how do you know anything? How do you know that it is possible to know anything? Like, clearly you are deranged. Now, possibly my favorite philosopher of all time, Michel Foucault, is one such thinker. So Foucault is a French philosopher who dedicates much of his work to these questions of how do we know things. This is what we would call epistemological questions. Now, Foucault's written a bunch of books, but the common theme is taking a phenomenon which we in the present day take to be like national, rational, objective classification and highlighting how this is in fact an unnatural and socially constructed understanding of the world. And he does this by detailing the historical processes which led to the development of this understanding. So even further, he usually adds on the conclusion that whilst we in the present think that we are more, humanitarian, developed, morally sophisticated, etc., than those in the past, these present systems can in fact be more coercive than the more apparently brutal and crude systems of historic periods. So he does this with a bunch of things. He does it with madness, he does it with sexuality, he does it with the criminal justice system and like modern Western science at large. In his most famous book, Discipline and Punish, he tackles the question of modern criminal justice systems and highlights that whilst, these modern systems seem to be more like lenient and forgiving and humanitarian than the often more brutal regimes of like public shaming and like physical punishment that we'd see in the Middle Ages, think, for example, like getting whipped in the village square for stealing a loaf of bread or something like that. They actually entail like a far greater level of coercion. And this is because, according to Foucault, modern criminal justice targets the rehabilitation of the mind and the soul. And the act of punishment is not completed until the criminal is seen to have changed like who he is fundamentally at core. And that's why we have things like, parole hearings, right? Whereas historic criminal punishment was very different. Even if it was more like visibly violent, the purpose was simply this like physical punishment and humiliation of the body rather than the alteration of the mind and the soul. So Foucault is here making an argument that flips quite a lot of stuff on its head. So firstly, it completely rejects the dominant understanding of historical time in Western academia. So like historical time is just a kind of time. Specifically, it's the kind of time that historians seek to explain. So for example, some time has passed in the time that I've been sitting at my desk recording the show, but it's not the kind of time that a historian would seek to explain. This is more what we'd call like individual or personal time. Historians seek to explain time as experienced by the collective, right? And traditionally, historians have understood this collective historical time as being both linear and progressive. So this means that they just see the past as like an earlier stage of development or evolution towards the present. There is a certain amount of continuity that is assumed between the past and the present, and the past is seen as like leading very neatly into the present. So for example, if a historian wanted to answer the question of like, how did Donald Trump get elected? They might choose to look at the election success of Ronald Reagan. And in order to assume that this is a reasonable strategy, they have to first assume that there's a certain amount of continuity between the society that elected Reagan and the society that elected Trump. They have to assume that they operate within the same system. They have to assume that they operate within the same timeline. So this assumption is only tenable because historians have generally shared in the modernists' material understanding of reality. They've seen it as this like objective, tangible thing that's like out there somewhere. Foucault rejects this completely. He emphasizes the social construction of reality. So reality is not an external thing. It is something that humans produce and reproduce. So for Foucault, the society of the 1700s doesn't just look a bit different from the society today. It's radically different from the society of today. And not necessarily because of like material advances that traditional historians would point at, like, for example, the development of railways, mass media, etc., but rather because the society of the 1700s had a completely different social construction of reality to the society of today. And these socially constructed realities are something he calls epistemes. And for Foucault, the true location of power is not in the hoarding of, material goods, as it is for like traditional Marxists. Rather, it is in the ability to assign meaning. It is in the ability to construct the episteme. So in Foucault, power is seen as something that's like much more diffuse than in Marx. It's not about like the economic elite. It's literally about knowledge. Knowledge and meaning is power, because it's through these systems of knowledge that you can persuade people to maintain the existing power structure, even where it's in opposition to their material interests. So an example that was given in a podcast that I listened to was the question of drug use. So why would you, the listener, decide not to go out and take like a shitload of heroin today? Is it because of the threat of criminal sanction? Or is it because you know that there are like health and addiction risks associated with that substance? Or is it maybe because heroin addicts are like fervently ostracized in society and you fear becoming one of them? Is it maybe a combination of all three? And these last two elements is what Foucault really adds to Marx. It's this social understanding of power, right? Now, Foucault's not a Marxist. In fact, he's like very critical of Marx, but he does operate within this same field of thought. And a lot of his early writings take Marx like as a starting point to build from. But where Marx saw power as purely like a material reality, so like, you know, the threat of police force, the hoarding of economic goods, the bourgeois versus the proletariat, all we have to lose is our chains, etc., etc., etc. Foucault emphasizes that true power is what shapes our subjectivity. It's what shapes like how we see the world. And this kind of power amounts to social control because it's actually no longer necessary to convince people not to take heroin purely with the threat of physical violence. Rather, the social threats of addiction and ostracization will be enough to get almost all the population to comply with the power structure and to feel good about it, right? Because Foucault also emphasizes that power is not purely oppressive, right? If it was, we would rebel much harder. Rather, power is a system that we all participate in to like a greater or lesser extent, and successful participation in that system can lead to a sense of accomplishment, fulfillment, and belonging. So under Foucault, the powerful in society do not even necessarily have to be involved in the maintenance of their own power. Rather, this can be outsourced to the masses at large who help to legitimize their position by subscribing to the knowledge structures that keep things as they are. And there's, a good contemporary example of this process at play in the hostile environment. So the hostile environment was a set of immigration policies that was passed by the Conservative Liberal Democrat Coalition in 2012. Now, outwardly, it sought to clamp down on illegal immigration by making it harder for undocumented migrants to reside in the UK, and thus, at least in theory, to boost the rate of quote-unquote voluntary return, which are really just deportations because there are no voluntary returns. Cannot stress that enough. But the way they made it harder for these individuals was by outsourcing the conduct of immigration checks to an increasingly random array of civil society actors. So, traditionally, it's the job of border control and home office officials to conduct immigration checks. But under the hostile environment, it was the job not only of these state officials, but everyone from landlords to healthcare providers to at one point school teachers to check on the immigration status of their fellow residents. Now, a Marxist reading of this policy would say that the compliance of these civil society actors was ensured by dishing out fines to those who failed to check on the immigration status of their fellow residents. But a Foucauldian reading of this policy would say that their compliance was ensured, sure, in part by these fines, but more importantly by an episteme which had naturalized suspicion towards migrants and had naturalized trust in the state, by an episteme which prevented local British citizens from viewing migrants as anything other than foreign. So the Foucauldian reading on community in this case would stress that, what fractures our community is not just material power in the form of fines or state violence, but also our own understanding of the world, our inability to stop viewing migrants as something alien. So to take another example of this kind of epistemological oppression and how it causes society to fracture, I want to look at an area that Foucault himself looked at in two of his early books. Now, I want to preface this section by saying that, I am not a mental health professional. Neither am I advocating against modern mental health strategies that people have found to work for them. Rather, I'm just using this example because, it unpacks a little bit of Marx and a little bit of Foucault. So what did Foucault have to say about mental health? Well, in his 1961 book, Madness and Civilization, he does this classic Foucault thing where he does this, kind of anti-history of a concept, where he traces a concept that we take to be a natural and objective category today and looks at its evolution over time and ultimately highlights that it's been socially constructed. So the traditional modern Western view of the category of madness is that this is a category that has emerged more clearly in the modern era because we are better able to diagnose it, given the advances in modern Western medical knowledge. Madness itself hasn't changed, we can just see it better today. So if madness looked different in the past, or if we thought about madness in a different way, this was only because we were less enlightened as a society. But Foucault flips this on its head and highlights how the modern way of treating those who have been, clinically diagnosed as insane is in many ways much more brutal than what was done to them in historical periods, as the modern mad are, segregated from society, isolated in asylums and other psychiatric institutions, and ultimately stripped of their social autonomy. In contrast, the historic mad, particularly individuals living before the turn of the 17th century, so 1600s, were not segregated and rejected from mainstream society. Instead, they were often seen as possessing a kind of special wisdom, at times being viewed as closer to God than rational and sane individuals. So according to Foucault, this comparatively more humane system begins to unravel with the historical period that he calls the Classical Age, which is, the beginning of the 1700s through to the 1800s, which ushers in this period of mass confinement of the insane. So basically locking them all up, right? And this pretty brutal system of classical confinement is then later humanized or sanitized in the 1800s with the ascent of clinical medicine in what Foucault calls the modern era. And that provides the sanitizing rationale for stripping individuals of their liberty, and suddenly they are confined not in actual prisons, but in asylums, sanatoria, hospitals, etc. 2 years later, he releases a book called The Birth of the Clinic in 1963, and this is really just a kind of sequel to The History of Madness that hones in on this transition between the classical and the modern era specifically, when clinical medicine becomes this sort of dominant form of medical knowledge. Now, what do I mean by clinical medicine? Well, I mean the kind of medicine that's practiced in modern Western hospitals, right? So the kind of medicine that deals with the treatment of diseases and conditions that are assumed to have a tangible physical location within the body. So, you have an infection, your doctor locates the source of the infection geographically within your body and gives you medication or maybe some kind of surgical treatment to target that infection. This kind of medicine relies on what Foucault called an objectification of the body, wherein the patient's body is seen as totally separate from their subjecthood, their personhood. Your body is seen just as a literal object onto which a disease has been transplanted, and if the doctor is skillful enough, they should be able to read the clues of this disease on your body. By contrast, historic or preclinical forms of medicine did not objectify the body in this way. So they may have been cruder or harsher, but the body of the patient was not seen as somehow separate from their personhood, and much more emphasis was given to the patient's own descriptions of their symptoms than to these kinds of physical clues. And this, according to Foucault, is the main shift between the preclinical and clinical medicine. It's not about technology or efficiency. It is about the underlying change in what he calls the medical gaze. So ultimately, also this shift created a massive power imbalance between doctor and patient, since the doctor was no longer reliant on the patient to describe their symptoms. The patient's involvement in the direction of their own medical care decreased substantially. So how are we going to tie this back into the question of community and modern mental health discourses? Well, I would argue, and again, I cannot stress this enough, I'm not a mental health professional, this is just my opinion, that we in the present have given over far too much power to a clinical understanding of mental illness. And this is not in any way to say that mental health does not have a real, tangible clinical dimension. It's just to say that this is not, the only dimension, and that this is perhaps the only dimension that we're really thinking about at the moment at the expense of everything else. So I was chatting the other day to an acquaintance who happens to work as a psychiatrist in A&E for the NHS, right? And she told me that the vast majority of people who she sees there are not people who are quote, mentally ill in a clinical sense, but rather people who are having very rational breakdowns in response to very extreme and complex living situations. So think, homelessness, drug addiction, domestic and sexual violence, abuse, etc. But by employing like a purely clinical lens on such individuals, you risk attempting to essentially like medicate away systemic issues. And like, yeah, sure, some Valium and some antidepressants are likely to provide a moment of respite in the interim period, but without addressing the underlying issues that are causing these mental breakdowns in the first place, the cycle will just like continuously repeat. And this pattern becomes even more clear when we look at the experiences of minority ethnic communities within the mental health care system in the UK. So now, ethnic and racial minorities in the UK are at a high risk of living in environments that are not like conducive to good mental health through higher rates of exposure to things like, poverty, family breakdown, bereavement, and racism. This being said, when they try to access mental health care, they are much more likely to experience harsh treatment, such as hospital detention and being physically restrained, than their white counterparts who are much more likely to be offered like outpatient or holistic care within their own communities. Even further, it's far more likely for ethnic and racial minorities in the UK to be referred to mental health care through crisis services or even like criminal justice system than their white counterparts who generally access this care through their GPs. So in the UK, there are both different routes into mental health care and different outcomes from mental health care depending on whether or not you are white British. And I think that says quite a lot about the fallibility of the supposedly infallible category of clinical medicine. And this is why I sometimes have an issue when people try to condense mental ill health down to an imbalance in brain chemistry. And I'm in no way qualified to say whether that is or isn't the case, but I do know that the entire discipline of psychiatry and even neuroscience is still very much in its early days. There's a lot more that we don't know about how the brain works than what we know about how it does work, right? Having said that, I do get why this is happening. I do get why people portray mental ill health as if it's this, definitely this chemical imbalance and nothing else. And I think it's because the suffering of mental ill health can be seen as in some way more legitimate if we manage to explain it as some kind of physical chemical process rather than an emotional or environmental one. But I think that this really shows the oppressive nature of the dominance of clinical medicine, that we cannot really recognize human suffering as truly legitimate unless we are able to apply a clinical medical diagnosis is really fucked up, right? And who do these narratives about brain chemistry serve at the end of the day? Pharmaceutical companies. If we condense down the lows of the human experience to a chemical experience, we open the door for the solution to be a pharmaceutical one. And I'm not saying that we should never have pharmaceutical interventions. I, for one, have taken antidepressants on more than one occasion, and they've definitely done me a lot of good. All I'm saying is that we shouldn't lean so blindly into a narrative which positions this as the only way to address societal suffering. Let's not try to medicate away capitalism, right? And I want to close this section with a little summary of a book by Dutch-American psychiatrist Bessel van der Kolk called The Body Keeps the Score. And I'm sure I've butchered the pronunciation of that name, but language is a social construct, so whatever, right? So in it, van der Kolk details his 3 decades of experience working with survivors of trauma of all stripes. And what I found perhaps the most interesting was his recounting of the struggles he and his team faced in getting the diagnostic category of complex post-traumatic stress disorder recognized by the Diagnostic Statistical Manual of Mental Health Disorders. So this manual, called the DSM, right, is put together by the American Psychiatric Association. And it's really important to get disorders recognized by the DSM because if you don't, American health insurance providers will not cover treatment for it. So anyway, the DSM recognized PTSD, traditional post-traumatic stress disorder, as a diagnosis in 1980, largely off the back of work that was being done with Vietnam War veterans. But it wasn't until 2013 that the category of complex PTSD was formally recognized by the DSM. Now, the difference between PTSD and complex PTSD, in the simplest terms, is that PTSD is seen as being triggered by a single event or a single short acute period where there is a clear before and after, for example, fighting in a war. And complex PTSD deals with traumatic events that are repeated, often happening over a long space of time, such as childhood abuse, right? Trauma experts began pushing for complex PTSD to be recognized as a separate diagnostic category as early as 1988, in large part because the survivors of complex PTSD often like displayed different symptoms, so could not really be diagnosed with PTSD, meaning that, without this separate diagnosis, they risked not being able to receive any medical treatment at all. And I think that this is another strong example of how flimsy a purely clinical understanding of mental health can be. No one in the right mind, forgive the pun, could realistically look at a survivor of childhood abuse or some other chronic trauma and say, like, your suffering isn't real. But that's exactly what clinical medicine did for a 33-year period between the diagnosis of PTSD and the final recognition of complex PTSD. And we cannot let a blind faith in clinical medicine disincentivize us from actively participating in community care, because we have seen time and time again the shortcomings of clinical medicine when it comes to addressing mental health. Like, if someone is suffering, they are not required to have a medical diagnosis to have that suffering recognized. Similarly, if someone is diagnosed, they are not required to rely solely on pharmaceutical interventions to address their suffering. For me, this means being presented with a lot more options when it comes to mental health treatment, right? Like, almost every person I know, whenever they've tried to seek like mental health care through their GP, has left at best with a prescription and a waitlist number, and at worst with just a prescription. And that is simply not good enough. Anyway, none of this is to say, like, just start taking herbs and shit and, like, fuck clinical medicine altogether. Just because, I'm critical of certain aspects of clinical medicine does not mean in any way that I'm saying, like, let's throw the whole thing in the bin. Like, we're not 4 years old. We should be able to talk about the shades of gray, Also, like, get vaccinated. Everyone get vaccinated for everything that you can. But anyway, on to our final philosopher. So the last guy I want to bring in on this question of community is another French postmodern philosopher called Jean Baudrillard. Now, full disclosure, I had never read any Baudrillard prior to like starting the research for this show, so I'm not like super familiar with everything that he's ever written, but I'd heard about his ideas and he seemed like a good one to bring in. So I now thoroughly regret that decision though. Seriously, like, no one read Baudrillard, it's awful. But anyway, despite being a total dick who's like never heard of a full stop and has this weird like Orientalist romanticization of what he calls like pre-capitalist gift economies, read, native cultures that he seems to thoroughly misunderstand, he does like make some interesting points, which we're going to dive into now. So, like Foucault, Baudrillard was kicking about from the 1960s onwards. He begins from a not-so-radical postmodern place of critiquing Marx, and his main critique is that Marx's understanding of political economy placed way too much emphasis on production and not enough on consumption. So for Marx, like, the most important and potentially most oppressive element of the economy was how goods were produced, since the method or means of production dictated the lived reality of the working masses. And Marx took big issue with the fact that workers in industrial societies did not get to enjoy the fruits of their labor, in that they did not own the final product of their work. Even further, he saw the entire like production process under capitalism as inherently alienating, since workers often did not even get to see the final product of their labor, particularly when production was segmented, as is the case under like Fordist production techniques. So this is where, each worker is responsible for making just one component of the final product, like in a factory line. And Marx saw this production process as alienating workers from their nature as human beings and stifling their creativity, essentially dehumanizing them to just another cog in the machine of capitalism. Baudrillard flips this on its head and emphasizes that in the affluent societies of late-stage capitalism, basically from like the 1950s onwards, the most important aspect of the political economy was not the means of production, but the means of consumption. So Marx is focusing on like how we make things and how that makes us feel. And Baudrillard is focusing on how and why we buy things and how that makes us feel. And on the question of why we buy things, Baudrillard emphasizes that the value of material objects goes far beyond the traditional understanding of like use and exchange value, like basically like how useful is it to us and what does it help us to do, and also how much can we sell it for. And instead argues that the true value of object hinges much more so on something he calls sign value and sign exchange value. So what's that? Well, essentially, Baudrillard is arguing that the true value of objects in late-stage capitalist societies is to signal to others the identity that we wish to assume. So, for example, you might buy a piece of furniture from like John Lewis instead of IKEA to signal a commitment to like more environmentally friendly manufacturing. More obviously, you might buy like a handbag from Gucci instead of a non-named brand to signal some kind of like affluence, right? So Baudrillard in his early work then is really building on the concept of conspicuous consumption, which was first coined by Thorstein Veblen in 1899. Absolutely no idea if that's the right pronunciation, but fuck it, we ball. Anyway, Veblen was exploring why people purchase luxury goods, or basically any good that was of an unnecessarily high quality. And he argued that the primary motivation of these kinds of like apparently superfluous investments was to signal to others your own economic power. So conspicuous consumption is a kind of performance of status, right? And Baudrillard is essentially arguing that all consumption is conspicuous, in that we are constantly performing our identities or even our desired identities through the consumption of objects. Most importantly, however, we as individuals are powerless to assign meaning to the objects that we consume. So the logic which dictates, this object signals like true wealth, this object signals being nouveau riche, this object signals like middle class aspiration, etc. All of that is decided not by individuals, but by the system of media which governs our daily lives. And in this sense, Baudrillard flips Marx on his head. So where Marx would argue that we are slaves to the means of production, Baudrillard would argue that we are slaves to the means of consumption. So from the late 1970s into the early 1980s, he begins taking this critique a step further by linking this shift to the permeation of postmodernism within society. So let's break that down a bit, because that's like quite a big sentence, right? So now we already talked about how postmodernism was characterized by a kind of skepticism about the ability of human beings to accurately perceive reality. And at the more extreme end, postmodern philosophy questions the very existence of some kind of objective external reality. So far, we've only looked at postmodernists who are essentially using postmodern thought as a way to critique theory. So Foucault is employing a kind of postmodern skepticism to unpick modernist understandings of the past, ones that were based in an almost arrogant certainty that we could in some way be right. And he is employing postmodern theory in a historical analysis. By contrast, Baudrillard is one of the few philosophers who starts to question what is and will be the impact of postmodern critique on the lived reality of human societies in the present and in the future. So not like, how can we use this new skepticism to reanalyze the past or reanalyze old theories, but rather how will this new skepticism impact the present? Essentially, what happens to society when we start to break down a certainty in reality? So Baudrillard argues that the postmodern break, as he calls it, means that not only are human beings theoretically skeptical about the concept of objective reality, but rather we actually live in a society with no single cohesive reality. We live in what he calls a society of hyper-reality, where the technological simulation of the lived experience through things like TV, film, the news, video games, and increasingly today social media are more important in how we experience reality than the banalities of everyday life. We are all more engaged with consuming this spectacle of hyperreality than we are with the material world around us. So in a way, this is a natural progression for Baudrillard. He begins by arguing that human beings in late-stage capitalist societies are driven primarily by logics of consumption. And then when he takes a closer look at what assigns and governs these logics of consumption, what assigns meaning to material objects, what dictates how and what we should consume, he starts looking at the impact of the media and changing technologies. And it's from here that he develops this concept of hyperreality. Now, to be honest, I find Baudrillard pretty tedious, right? So he argues that the lived experience of human beings under hyperreality is substantively different from at any other point in history, but he doesn't really use history to argue that. So he doesn't, for example, explain what it is about modern media that is so substantively different from historical forms of media like print media, theater, music, etc., etc. Not to say that it's not substantively different, it's just that he doesn't really give you that argument. And because of this lack of comparison, I don't really get a good sense of what reality is to him, what exactly it is that we're missing under hyperreality. He spends much of his career describing how we've become so completely detached from reality that we live in this matrix-like state, but I have no idea what he would understand to be reality. And maybe I'm biased because, I'm a historian, but that seems like a pretty important point to make. And having said that, like, I do find his characterization of modern life as one of this kind of addiction towards the constant performance of the self through both the consumption of goods and media very interesting. He even insists this impetus is so embedded in us that we are almost completely unconscious of the fact that this is what we're doing when we consume goods and media. And this fatalism is really crucial in Baudrillard because he doesn't believe that we can ever truly escape this condition of hyperreality, even if we do become more or less conscious of it. So the Baudrillardian take on community might be something like, we have all become so obsessed with participating in the outward consumption of our own identities that we have absolutely no autonomy in deciding what that identity is. Even further, there is no way for us to meaningfully stop participating in this process of identity consumption. There is no way for us to construct our own meanings outside the logics of hyperreality. So that's all a bit convoluted. So I want to bring in what I think might be like a real world example, which will hopefully clear it up. And that example is the Free Britney movement. Now, we all know the story about Britney Spears, or at least we think we know the story, and that's kind of the point, right? In 2007, following several years of brutal media harassment, the American singer and songwriter Britney Spears has a very public mental breakdown in which, she shaves her head, she gets into a number of traffic accidents, she repeatedly checks herself in and out of rehab, struggles over custody of her 2 children, she assaults a paparazzi photographer, and is even eventually institutionalized on psychiatric grounds in 2008. Britney was then put under an archaic legal arrangement designed in the first instance to safeguard individuals with dementia, wherein her father retains total control over her financial, professional, social, and even medical life. A number of Britney's fans become increasingly concerned about this arrangement, and as early as 2009, set up a website called freebritney.net. Fast forward to today, and the Free Britney movement grows and grows and grows, and is now the subject of several high-budget documentaries, including one by the New York Times, but still the conservatorship remained in place. So how does this relate to Baudrillard? Well, in a way, Britney Spears' life is like a key example of both the supremacy and the inescapability of hyperreality. So what do I mean by that? Well, I think most reasonable people would agree that the intense media scrutiny that followed Britney her entire life severely impacted her quality of life, right? And largely dictated what her lived reality was. So in the early years of her fame, where she was known as like America's sweetheart, and there was this, super creepy obsession with her virginity, it didn't matter like whether or not she was actually a virgin. What mattered was that she was still perceived as such. And the weight of maintaining this perception materially affected her lived reality, affected like the kinds of clothes that she could wear, the kinds of music that she could make, etc. But when that all came crashing down in 2002, after Justin Timberlake threw her under the fucking bus with his comments to the media after their breakup, essentially insisting that they had had sex, her lived conditions became materially worse. And she was pretty much universally reviled as this kind of like slut, right? Especially because Timberlake had implied that she cheated on him in his video for the song Cry Me a River. Now, we have no idea whether any of this is true, but the media constructed a perception that it was true, and that was more true than whatever the truth was. So I think this shows, firstly, the supremacy of hyperreality, right? Media perceptions are more important than lived experiences. On the inescapability of hyperreality, I would point instead directly at the Free Britney movement. Now, this is a movement which, recognizes the role of the media in bringing great suffering and injustice to the life of Britney Spears. Nevertheless, merely by existing, the Free Britney movement continues to pull media attention towards her. So even as they try to undo the historic harms perpetrated by the media, the movement is itself inadvertently continuing this cycle of media scrutiny. And in the week that the New York Times documentary Framing Britney was released, Google searches for Britney Spears went up by a factor of 10. Even more crucially, the interest spurred by this documentary outlasted and outgrew the initial conversation surrounding its release, with Google searches for Britney Spears reaching even higher peaks 2 months later on the date of her much-anticipated conservatorship hearing. So I think this points to the inescapability of hyperreality, right? Like, we have no meaningful way to escape the grip that the media has over our lives. Just as like the Free Britney activists tried to free her from this media scrutiny, they caused even more media scrutiny, because even our attempts to roll it back require participation in the very system that we are attempting to dismantle. Now, obviously, all of that's a huge bummer, and one of the many reasons for which I fucking hate Baudrillard, but I don't want to end this show on a bummer. So, what can we take from this that's not entirely negative? Okay, so we're in the home stretch now, guys. Let's wrap up this shit show so I can please, for the love of God, never think about Baudrillard again. So a quick summary of what we've covered so far before we do the main takeaway. So throughout the show, we've been looking at this question of community, and I've come at it kind of sideways. And instead of just doing like a straight political science or anthropology take, I've tried to look at this issue philosophically. Within that, we've covered 3 different philosophers, 2 of which I like, the third of which I will see in hell, and we've outlined what each of their takes might be on the breakdown of community. At core, each take hinges on a different understanding of power and thus oppression and exploitation. So the Marxist take is straight up historical materialism. Real power lies with the power to control the means of production, and so what oppresses us and fractures our communities is the system that governs this means of production. Within our present-day context, this would mean the shift away from the collectivist organization of the economy under Keynesianism in the post-war years, which advocated for strong state intervention to ensure the collective good, towards this like fiercely individualistic form of free market capitalism, which saw a resurgence under Thatcher, an economic system which I have argued has much more in common with the political economy of the Victorian era than with the kind of welfare statism that we saw under Keynes. For Foucault, true power lies not just in material power, but much more importantly in epistemological power. This is to say, for Foucault, true power is the power to construct meaning, because it is through these systems of meanings that the rules of society are set. By being able to designate X behavior as good and Y behavior as bad, and have people subscribe to those views, you don't even really need material power to ensure social control. So we saw how, for Foucault, power is much more diffuse than in Marx, because we all participate in this system of constructing meanings to some extent, even if that system is oppressive to us personally. So Foucault would place the burdens of community not so much on this like shadowy, materially wealthy elite like Marx would, but on each of our individual understandings of the world. Foucault would stress that if we want to think about what hinders our ability to form community, we should think what constructs our understandings of community and what it is that designates some groups as insiders and some as outsiders. Then we move to the much dreaded Baudrillard. Again, like Foucault, Baudrillard has a diffuse understanding of power. It's not located within, the tangible ownership of material goods, but rather in the system which assigns value to these material goods. Unlike Foucault, however, he takes a much more media studies approach to the question of assigning meaning and ultimately concludes that there is no way to escape the simulation of reality constructed by our media-soaked environment, that we are trapped in a state of increasing hyper-reality. So returning to what do we do with that take, that's not a huge bummer, while there can be something very liberating about accepting the inescapable. Now, I don't mean to say that we should just accept oppression or whatever else, but at a personal level, I feel it can be freeing to just sit with the things we know we can't change. So I think about like the serenity prayer that they use in Alcoholics Anonymous quite a lot when, I'm struggling with stuff like this, right? And it's the one that goes like, God, give me the serenity to accept the things that I cannot change, the courage to change the things that I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. Now, I'm not a religious person, but I think even an atheist or an agnostic person can take something really meaningful for this. Like, if we accept that there are things that we cannot change, we free ourselves from the constant burden of having to struggle against it. Now, I was talking about this a few weeks ago with some friends, and we were talking about like how we wish other people would deal with like various periods of struggle. And the most common response was that everyone is really like looking for someone who would just like sit in it with them, someone who wouldn't immediately try to like come up with uninvited solutions or suggestions, someone who could understand like, yeah, this is just going to be shit for a while, and then one day it's not. And I think that takes this same kind of radical acceptance of looking at something that you want to change, that you would like to be different, and just letting that struggle wash over you. So I'd like to pitch this as a solution to Baudrillard's fatalism. Like, yes, maybe there are things that are wrong with our perception of reality, and maybe we cannot really escape that. But precisely because we can't, why be so fucking bothered about it? Just lean into the chaotic vibes. Like, there's nothing else we can really do. So I've been Militant Empathy, and this has been On Community. I'll see you next time. You can find me on all major podcasting platforms and on YouTube. If you really like the show, you can subscribe to our Patreon. That's patreon.com/militantempathy. And there you will be able to get access to all the full show scripts. If you want to plagiarize them for your upcoming university essays, I have no objections. You have my consent. So keep checking back in. All right, give us your money. Thanks.